Great.
My name's Todd Daly. I teach theology and ethics at Urbana Theological Seminary in Champaign, Urbana. We started as actually a satellite location for TEDS, or the Divinity School, before I arrived there. But I am assigned with teaching theology and ethics and Christianity and contemporary culture. I did my PhD research on slowing down human aging from a theological perspective. This particular talk is way out of left field for me, and will be a bit of a stretch, but I think it qualifies as a new issue. I've been associated with CBHD for several years. I've been a fellow, I think, for 3 or 4 years or something like that. I live in Champaign, Urbana, and I'm thrilled to be up here. And yeah, that's enough. I want to thank you ahead of time for your patience, assuming that I don't test it, and for your attention, assuming that I'm able to keep it. For a few years now, scientists have been able to use human pluripotent stem cells to generate various organoids, artificially grown masses of cells or tissues that resemble different organs. Several techniques have been developed to both induce and suppress stem cell differentiation, coupled with more recent 3D tissue culturing methods, have yielded more complex and realistic organoids. These organoids have proved especially useful for gaining insight into organ development and disease modeling, though presently they're not without their limitations. For instance, media factors can easily complicate their creation. Organoid development and growth are frequently stunted due to their inability to deliver nutrients and eliminate waste. Nevertheless, this continual evolution of synthetic biology, coupled with increasing precision and control in outfitting human pluripotent stem cells with particular developmental pathways, have led to increasingly complex organoids, which provide still better models for research. But perhaps no development has been more significant than the recently discovered ability to induce human pluripotent stem cells, non-embryonic stem cells, into exhibiting totipotent behavior, which includes the power of self-organization and the execution of a body plan. In 2014, researchers were able to produce embryoid bodies with pluripotent stem cells in mice. And 2 years ago, researchers at the University of Cambridge were able to grow microcolonies of embryonic stem cells in mice in a 3D culture, which self-organized and developed in a manner that closely paralleled canonical mice embryos up through the early post-implantation stage, including the initial phases of mesoderm generation. All right, in 2016, similar techniques were carried out with human pluripotent stem cells. And scientists have demonstrated that these cells are capable of undergoing self-organized development in vitro into various early stage organoid structures, including a brain, an eye, and the gut. But they've also created embryo-like structures. Significantly, these in vitro bodies are structures recapitulated epiblastic formation that mimicked the early stages of pro-amniotic cavity development in canonical embryos, but in the absence of maternal tissues, even though they did not go on to develop later epiblastic features. A group of Harvard researchers have dubbed these organisms SHEEFS, synthetic human entities with embryo-like features. Admittedly, a whole lot hinges on the term embryo-like, as these entities are not currently subject to the 14-day rule of canonical human embryos. At present, this allows for the possibility of engineering SHEEFS that develop beyond 2 weeks. However, scientists argue that the most useful information would come from developing sheaths that mimic canonical embryonic development as closely as possible, which would include developing a synthetic human embryo. That's their terminology. The concern here, however, is that synthetic embryos might then be subject to the 14-day limit, which applies to canonical human embryos. And while many scientists appear to support the regulation of sheaths, one gets the feeling that many are wary of any regulation that might get in the way and might limit scientists from examining later stage development of sheaths where more useful knowledge is thought to be found. In echoing some of these concerns, these aforementioned Harvard researchers, geneticists, which include John Each, hopefully I'm not mispronouncing his name, and George Church, have called for new regulations to accommodate this particular research. They argue that simply extending this current 14-day limit on canonical or non-synthetic embryos is ill-suited for sheaths because of their structural complexities that are involved in the development. In their mind, they are far too varied for the well-defined linear progression of canonical embryos from zygote to blastocyst and the formation of the primitive streak. As Church and his colleagues point out, continuing advances are setting the stage for more complex sheaths that are surprisingly adaptable to non-natural conditions and able to develop with considerable plasticity in recapitulating aspects of embryogenesis, including the potential to accumulate new embryonic features as they mature. They reference a 2014 study where a sheath was generated via HPSC, or human pluripotent stem cell colony micropatterning, which gave rise to a well-formed circular-shaped primitive streak that was adapted to the shape of this particular micropattern, a shape notably different from the more linear-shaped primitive streak that occurs in naturally generated embryos. But we are gently warned to expect the development of some sheaths that are very different from human embryos. For instance, Church and his colleagues speculate that it may be possible to generate sheaths that proceed through new relation without having first developed through a primitive streak, giving rise to entities capable of experiencing sentience or pain. They say it may also be possible to have a 20-day-old sheath that has not gone through new relation at all, or a 5-day-old sheath that has. If you feel free to reference, I'm lifting the one helpful diagram from the article that I'm interacting with that tries to map out what's going on here. These possibilities, they say, show just how ill-suited the current standard, based as it is on the linear progression of canonical embryos, is when it comes to sheaths. Using an insightful metaphor, they liken current regulations to a highway with a very clear stop sign at day 14. However, due to the expanding powers of synthetic biology, sheaths are capable, in their words, of off-roading, of going places where there are no well-marked roads, much less stop signs. So they liken any future regulations as more broadly territorial in nature, marked by, in their words, the occasional perimeter fence. We don't need to build a wall, we need a perimeter fence. It may be worth pausing briefly at this point to consider just this insightful metaphor. For while I think it does help explain their argument for the non-technical person like myself, it also seems to capture something of the relentlessly inquisitive scientific spirit. They may be tapping into the allure of fresh frontiers, of wanderlust, of making one's own road, westward expansion, discovering new things. However, if there weren't already serious moral objections to the linear highway with the stop sign at day 14, we might be tempted to liken this project to leaving the straight and narrow. Informed by the ethical principles and methodologies that led to the 14-day rule for research on human embryos, Ock and Church and their Harvard colleagues argued that new research guidelines should be established, and based on the appearance of features or capacities associated with the emergence of moral status. They propose a preliminary research boundary around the appearance of neural substrates rather than the primitive streak. And I'm quoting, and the functionality required for the experience of pain, unquote. Ock and Church and their colleagues go on to outline in this report a four-step process that follows the methodology employed by the commissions that developed the 14-day rule. So first, they call for an expansive discussion about the biological features and capacities of non-synthetic or canonical embryos whose emergence is deemed morally significant, while being mindful that adapting this for SHEEFS will require, in their words, a broad catalog of morally significant features, which they emphasize should be created, I'm quoting again, without abridgment or preferential attention to the first appearing feature. Though appreciative of the methodology employed in the Warnock Commission, they are critical for their excessively narrow focus on pain as a morally relevant feature, and reference a 1994 report of the Human Embryo Research Panel as providing a better example of a broad catalog of morally relevant features. Though this particular report supported the findings of the Warnock Commission, it also considered other potentially morally relevant benchmarks, such as the beginning of brain activity or function, well-developed cognitive abilities like consciousness, reasoning, or the possession of a self-concept. It also cited other often mentioned features like human form or survival outside of the mother's womb and the onset of the heartbeat around day 22. Extending this discussion to SHEEFS would involve revisiting these reports with a view to expanding the threshold of what they call moral status signifying features. The second step involves considering which, if any, features of this updated moral catalog for non-synthetic embryos might be considered for SHEEFS. Here they suggest enlisting the help of sociologists to probe for moral concerns or reactions to the occurrence of such features in possible SHEEFS, looking in particular for reactions of combinations of signifying features. They anticipate, or though they anticipate, moral objections that mirror those leveled against contemporary canonical embryo research, they acknowledge that obtaining well-defined reactions to SHEEFS may be extremely difficult based on their sheer novelty. A SHEEF, for instance, that combines a beating heart and a brain while lacking the capacity for pain and sensation might evoke uncertain reactions. I don't know how uncertain a reaction that might actually evoke. They also foresee yuck responses, for instance, to SHEEFS that possess a recognizable human form, including a beating heart but without a brain. However, they quickly dismiss any kind of recoiling as falling short of an articulated moral objection. Nevertheless, every response should be cataloged as a data point pertinent to the question of what research limits might be applied to SHEEFS. At this point, philosophers might then be brought in to see if the various responses could be aligned into, in their words, systematic conceptual frameworks for the moral status of SHEEFS. Philosophers could also help formulate conceptual frameworks to define the meaning of developmental potential for SHEEFS. Bear with me here. The third step, and the crucial step, involves identifying the particular biological substrates and functionalities that underpin these moral status identifying features. Here, Church and his colleagues stress the need for experts in developmental biology acknowledging that there are various degrees of biological concreteness of particular features. So if, for instance, a beating heart was identified as a moral status signifying feature for SHEEFS, then it would be helpful to draw on the fairly detailed map of the embryonic cell types that participate in cardiogenesis in mice, which could then be integrated with embryological, cell culture, and molecular data from humans. They acknowledge, however, the difficulties in identifying biological substrates corresponding to more abstract signifying features such as developmental potential. In addition, they urge caution when it comes to pain. For even though the neural pathways that underlie pain perception have been mapped out with considerable detail, uncertainties remain concerning the composition and functionalities of these pathways in embryos. Finally, they also concede at some point that moral status signifying features of SHEEFS, such as possessing a human form, might be better approached through sociological methods rather than biology. Once again, their main point here is that possible research limits be based primarily on the biological substrates of whatever these moral status signifying factors might be. So, for instance, a research limit prohibiting the creation of SHEEFS capable of experiencing pain might require two forms of neurons in the pathway from nociception to cortex to be absent or non-functional. Once these first three steps have been accomplished, the final step involves setting up exploratory committees consisting primarily of researchers and bioethicists from around the globe to look into the moral and scientific issues raised by SHEEFS. Though they concede that guidelines and research limits may ultimately be necessary through a more formal commission, their task, that is the exploratory committee's task, would be best served, or rather, the formal commissions would be best served by considering the findings of these exploratory committees. It's worth noting here that these Harvard geneticists urge paying close attention to viewpoints, and I'm quoting, that accept moral status as developmentally emergent, unquote, while insisting that opposing viewpoints would also have their say. They also point out that the exploratory nature of these committees should encourage participants to move from a place of initial uncertainty to formulated viewpoints through a variety of forums, conferences, themed journal issues, and open challenges for researchers and bioethicists alike. As an example, they suggest that scientists work on generating a synthetic embryonic disc in mice capable of neurulation without a primitive streak, while philosophers and bioethicists could be challenged to consider whether or under what conditions generating a human pain-sensing sheath might be ethically permissible. And I'm quoting, given the high scientific and medical importance of understanding human pain, unquote. The potential applications for this research are certainly alluring. In addition to the possibility of engineering specific tissues and organs without creating or destroying human embryos, SHEEFS could be used for disease modeling and testing cancer and diabetic drugs. Equally enticing is the use of SHEEFS to gain fundamental knowledge about the early stages of canonical embryogenesis. Knowledge of post-implantation embryonic development could provide insight into certain developmental disorders. But as Ock and his Harvard colleagues are fully aware, the most useful knowledge would require generating SHEEFS that are as close as possible to, in their language, non-synthetic embryos without triggering research restrictions that would apply to them. They express little doubt that the rapid development of synthetic biology will soon make this possible. In the meantime, their call to create more advanced forms of embryo-like structures as models for human biology is being echoed by others in the scientific community. What in the world are we to make of all this? it's a real question, but later. There's a lot to take in. Sheaths that are engineered to mirror canonical embryos in vitro. Sheaths that admit of novel combinations, such as a beating heart with a brain incapable of sensing pain. Sheaths with a recognizable human form, beating heart, but no brain. Sheaths engineered to bypass a primitive streak while developing some kind of nervous system. To date, there has not been much ethical reflection on the possibility of engineering these human creatures who are more than a clump of cells, but we hesitate to call human beings. What little Christian reflection, which has taken place, what little Christian reflection exists, which has taken place, is focused in on morally relevant features that might indicate when these unique human entities are indeed worthy of protection. So for instance, John Homeland has offered a series of brief reflections on the bioethics blog of Trinity International University. He asks, how far shall we go in the name of treating disease or understanding human biology? What strange beasts shall we create? Homeland is, I think, rightly suspicious of this project. He also rejects the concept of moral status as an emergent property, holding that human life begins at conception is therefore worthy of protection. Therefore, insofar as sheaths are engineered to be very much like embryos in a dish, he believes that they deserve the same protection that all other embryos deserve, whether made the old-fashioned way, in his language, or through IVF. Hence, they should be neither created nor destroyed for research purposes. However, sheaths combining features in novel ways are more challenging. When it comes, for instance, to sheaths engineered to develop a nervous system without passing through the primitive streak, he suggests that the development of a nervous system is, in his words, morally relevant, and that such creatures should never be produced. In a later post, he reiterates this point, citing that, in his words, a nervy sheath, that is, a sheath of the human nervous system capable of sensing pain, brings us to a moral boundary of sorts, and is, in his words, the clearest marker of an immortal, non-material soul. Therefore, for Homeland, even drawing up its design constitutes a moral boundary. But others, like Bill Cheshire, have pointed out the inadequacies of the capacity to feel pain as an adequate marker of human moral status. After all, it is possible to suppress nociception with a local anesthetic. Moreover, nociception must be distinguished from pain. The experience of pain would require something like a functional cerebral cortex. His point, I think, and you can correct me at some point, is that using pain as a criterion for sheaths allows quite a lot of room for the creation of sheaths with nociception, rather than ask what it means for a human organism to experience pain. Cheshire says a better question is, and I'm quoting, what does it mean to be the kind of being that experiences pain? Unquote. In response, Homeland concedes that he made, in his words, a rather breezy connection between a rudimentary nervous system and the identification of a soul, but maintains that his approach has merit. It is worth considering the moral status of the various kinds of sheaths that may one day be produced. But I wonder, however, that the kinds of reflections that Homeland offers are somewhat problematic in that they appear to accept, to some degree, the kind of argumentation employed by those who support research on human embryos up to 14 days. That is, we're engaging in the kind of emergent feature-based morality that we might otherwise want to resist, the kind found in the Warnock report. As Michael Banner has noted, the feature-based morality displayed in this report views humanity as an achievement requiring certain qualifications. He trenchantly observes that there are no explicit arguments to convince us that the appearance of the primitive streak is of moral significance, but rather only assertions, and claims that their underlying anthropology shares a family resemblance to Aristotle's assertion that nature itself determines some to be slaves and others to rule. Therefore, appealing to the development of something resembling a nervous system as a moral boundary seems on some level like accepting the terms of the debate. Granted, however, I think we have to admit SHEEFS are far more ambiguous biologically than a human embryo. But I think we should be troubled by the recommendations to draw on the findings of the Warnock report in creating an updated catalog of morally relevant features for SHEEFS and the biological substrates related to them. Features that include well-developed cognitive abilities like consciousness, reasoning, and the possession of self-concept. And even further, capacity for survival outside of the mother's womb. No less troubling is the assertion that the determination of such features is best left to the experts. The subtle and perhaps not so subtle subtext of their report suggests that they're fully capable of policing themselves. But when applying this method to SHEEFS, assigning moral value to the appearance of certain features appears no less arbitrary than in the case of canonical embryos. Asserting that other features might be identified in the absence of the primitive streak, including the functionalities associated with those features, leaves more fundamental questions like what gives these particular biological features moral significance unanswered. Moreover, while they intend to include sociologists and possibly philosophers in constructing new regulations, philosophers in particular would not be addressing these more fundamental questions or articulating the anthropologies needing to answer them. It feels a bit more like a PR campaign at this point. At this point, I want to back up, if you're still with me, and consider what the generation of SHEEFS might mean more broadly. This is related to Oliver O'Donovan's insistence that the question, what is going on, is crucial to any Christian ethic that values practical reasoning. This question is meant to describe the way the world fits together. That just seems impossibly complex. Though I think it has to be attempted. It may be worth situating the creation of SHEEFS in a broader context by considering some of the thoughts and values that inform this project, including the understanding of human nature implicit in it. So a few general observations. First, insofar as the creation of SHEEFS appears as the latest iteration of our relentless quest for useful knowledge, in this case, knowledge of early embryonic development, we might describe this project as Baconian. Though Francis Bacon's motives for freeing scientific inquiry from the strictures of final and formal causes were rooted in Christian theology, namely as a way of cultivating useful or instrumental knowledge in order to relieve man's estate and restore our dominion over nature, this new method of science has shown itself capable of adapting to other meta-narratives. If Bacon envisioned the pursuit of material and efficient causes as the way to recapture the glory of prelapsarian Adam, the quest for material and efficient causes is no less at work in creating synthetic embryos for instrumental knowledge. Knowledge that may one day help us arrest developmental disorders and defeat cancer. But as Alan Verhey once noted, some Baconian accounts of knowledge basically arm compassion with artifice and not necessarily with wisdom. Certainly, Bacon is not entirely to blame. The rise of nominalist thought, was also thought important to the flourishing of inductive science. For if generic equivalence is reduced to the creative imposition of the mind on a universe filled only with particulars, then we are almost encouraged to experiment with new genetic orderings. That's O'Donovan, that's not me. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. And these experiments invite strange and possibly unanswerable questions, like what would it mean to produce an entity that has a human heart and a brain incapable of sensation or pain? How might one determine the relationship between a human entity and a human being? Similarly, if nature is blind to any purpose beyond the accidents of natural selection, we are not only encouraged to experiment with new genetic orderings, but to impose our own order on it. As the Scottish theologian John Daly once noted, when nature is believed to have no preordained meaning or purpose in itself, the speculative interest in it fails, and the remaining concern is only to subdue its inherent purposelessness to our own chosen ends, unquote. Though we should be thankful for the many ways in which modern science has contributed to human flourishing. And clearly, science is still predicated on order and describing the world through math and regularity, which runs against a hyper-nominalist impulse. Our reasons for manipulating the natural order are usually situated within some type of meta-narrative, which brings up a final general observation about the narrative that I suspect informs the development of SHEEFS. We might describe the development of SHEEFS as a soteriological project. And here I can see that I'm going after the low-hanging fruit in George Church's monograph, co-authored by Ed Regis, on synthetic biology. In his measured and circumspectly entitled book, Regenesis, How Synthetic Biology Will Reinvent Nature and Ourselves, Church anticipates using synthetic technology to improve human health, extend the lifespan, increase our memory and our intelligence. Regenesis. We must be born again. Salvation through synthetic biology, and perhaps with an eye towards salvation from biology. Church considers any living organism as essentially, I'm quoting, a ready-made, prefabricated production system, unquote, governed by its own genome. Developing genomic technologies will enable us to improve upon what nature has already accomplished. So a first step might involve making all humans, in his mind, immune to all known and unknown viruses. But toward the end of his book, he acknowledges that synthetic biology will be a core feature, in his words, toward our march, or in our march toward transhumanism. All of nature, it seems, is up for redesign and improvement. And this invites some significant and major questions concerning nature and whether it is possible to serve any longer as a moral category. I know that's just a huge issue, and we'll come back to that shortly. But the language employed by Ock and Church and their Harvard colleagues reflects, I think, a deep ambivalence at best over nature. On the one hand, they refer to embryos resulting from the conjoining of egg and sperm as canonical embryos. On the other, these same creatures are also referred to as non-synthetic embryos. I think their use of canonical is a curious choice, insofar as canonical generally refers to a standard or reed, a canon, by which other entities are judged. It makes some kind of sense. Though it is considered a rule or a standard, it seems to hold, however, very little authority as such. Canonical embryos appear devoid of any kind of normative status, or at least the kind that would protect them from creation for research purposes. The nomenclature of non-synthetic embryos occurs more frequently. And while it seems unlikely that this is a deliberately pejorative term, it may just be an issue of style. The subtle via negativa of non-synthetic suggests a frame of reference for evaluating human creatures which privileges the designed over the given. I mean, who wants, when you preface anything with the word non, it kind of loses its appeal. Who wants non-fat eggnog at Christmas? Although you may find eggnog in all of its forms revolting. Either way, ours is an age of anxious ambiguity, where we simultaneously clamor for organic products that are all natural, while celebrating our abilities to alter our natural hair color, skin tone, sexual drive, cognitive powers, or sleeping patterns. I may be making too much of this nomenclature. Though Ock and Church and their colleagues seem to view nature as significantly malleable, many think that gaining information on early embryonic development through the creation of sheaths with an eye toward eliminating certain cancers and genetic diseases is difficult to criticize. At the same time, however, the creation of sheaths and synthetic embryos is troubling, and with Holmland, I find myself resisting the creation of these novel human forms. It's also difficult to avoid speculating on particular hypothetical combinations, and equally difficult to avoid privileging one aspect of human development as morally normative, like a central nervous system. Whether or not it's even helpful or wise to identify ensoulment with the appearance of a central nervous system, it seems that some appeal to nature as normative lies behind Holmland's concerns. This desire to appeal to nature has been well attested in the subtle and eloquent works of Leon Kass, Francis Fukuyama, and Michael Sandel. They serve as recent examples who argue that nature itself has a normative significance and thus sets moral limits to our boundaries, our boundless quest for knowledge, especially when it comes to altering our human traits and capacities. The success of these works remains disputed, leaving open the question whether or not nature can indeed have the kind of moral significance or the moral force necessary without perhaps some appeal to the transcendent. And admittedly, one way to ground the normativity of human knowledge is by appealing to the incarnation of Christ. And so as I work towards a conclusion, I want to draw on the language in this report by Ock and Church, because it may be useful to explore the possibility of canonizing human development Christologically, which might allow us to make some preliminary judgments about sheaths and synthetic embryos in light of humanity as it has been taken up in the person of Jesus Christ. This approach, some may recognize, draws on the insights of Karl Barth, who argued that in the Incarnation, we are presented with humanity as it is meant to be in Jesus of Nazareth. In other words, Christology determines anthropology. For Barth, to be a human creature is to be, quoting him now, determined by God for life with God. And as Gerald McKinney has observed, the question of human nature for Barth is the question of the characteristics of human nature that equip us to share in the divine life. We are beings who have been drawn into this covenant history with God. Our very being is determined by God for this relationship. This means that our creaturely nature is not in conflict with our divine determination for this kind of fellowship. And one of his major points is that our finite, embodied, creaturely nature is the very sign of our divine determination for fellowship with God. So if the humanity of Christ reveals that we are divinely determined for fellowship as human creatures, which serve as a normative claim for human creatures, then any deliberate departure from the functions, traits, and capacities that would impair or rule out this kind of fellowship with God would mark as a departure from this norm. But I'm wondering if the Incarnation doesn't also speak more specifically to embryogenesis and the biological processes intrinsic to it as a kind of moral norm. In effect, canonizing it in ways that would preclude or cast considerable doubt on the morality of synthetic embryos. If the divine Logos has been enjoined to human nature in the person of Jesus Christ, and hypostatically, might this not be a divine vindication of human development from zygote to blastocyst and onward? It may be helpful to recall that the doctrine of the incarnation was beset by numerous heretical interpretations on many sides. For instance, the idea that the incarnation was a fusion or a synthesis of the divine and human was explicitly rejected by the Church, driven in part by Gregory Nazianzen's soteriological concerns. The unassumed is the unhealed. The Chalcedonian formula that confessed a hypostatic or personal union of the divine and human natures in Christ without confusion was an explicit attempt to avoid any kind of synthetic Christ, whether a synthesis of natures, as in Eutyches, or a synthesis between a human body and a divine mind, as in Apollinarius. In the later case, it's interesting to observe that Apollinarius could refer to Christ as a synthetic anthropoid, a synthesis anthropoides, because the human mind was thought to be changeable, passable, subject to impure thoughts. He reasoned that Jesus' mind could only be divine. Though he could affirm the goodness of the human body, in his understanding of the incarnation, the body becomes an instrument to the divine mind. Granted, in discussing sheaths, we're not talking about a synthesis of the divine and the human, but there may still be some lessons here. For the Chalcedonian formula, which confesses this hypostatic union of the divine Logos with the humanity, with human nature in the person of Jesus Christ, one person, two natures, united without confusion, without conversion, without division, without separation, tells us that the earliest processes of human development are more than just accompanied by the divine Logos, for here we affirm that God has become man in Jesus Christ, but also remains man without ceasing to be God. So perhaps we might speak of the incarnation as canonical activity, as a divine vindication of this particular form of human growth and development, a divine vindication of human development initiated by Jesus' conception by the Holy Spirit. Granted, Christians confess the incarnation as a mystery, which means that some questions might ultimately prove unanswerable. We may doubt whether Jesus' conception will yield to the kinds of questions asked by geneticists, whether or the degree to which, for instance, Jesus' nascent humanity can be fully described in embryonic or genetic language. Nevertheless, it seems that God's dwelling among us by passing through gestation may be the kind of vindication needed to respect this particular order of nature in human development, while perhaps questioning others. But bear with me, we're almost there, last page. So how might we assess the creation of sheaths within this framework? I think there may be good reasons to engage in some kind of synthetic biology in order to develop, say, various organoids, in order to study their function with a view toward treating various maladies. I mean, this application at least seems to respect human gestation as in some ways normative. This might also apply to growing a new organ from one's own genetic material to replace a diseased one, though there may be other reasons for rejecting that. I don't think a Christologically canonized embryogenesis would preclude certain kinds of genetic manipulation during gestation in treating disease either. I could be totally wrong. Synthetic embryos seem more difficult. Are we able to say that they should never be created? For Church and his colleagues, much depends on the catalog of morally relevant features. And maybe all that can be said is that the closer synthetic embryos come to canonical embryos, which, if allowed to develop, would have the potential for fellowship with God and other creatures, the more morally problematic they become, especially if higher order functions like consciousness are no longer considered morally relevant features. Though we can appreciate the desire to learn more about early stage development developmental disorders in an effort to alleviate suffering. Should synthetic embryos be employed for such purposes, their destruction would seem no less problematic than the destruction of canonical embryos, for these creatures would be the object of human or more human than divine determination, though I'm sure that's a gross oversimplification. Serving instrumental purposes that fall well short of divine fellowship. Admittedly, I don't know if it's even possible to determine when a synthetic embryo is distinguishable from a canonical one, or indistinguishable from a canonical one. There are probably other helpful questions we could ask of this project. I think it's worthwhile to envision the potential consequences of these scientific developments. There are also questions that are not so much aimed at setting up moral boundaries or grounding appeals to nature, but ones that center on who we are as humans and how our various capacities to reorder nature shape our thoughts, attitudes, and disposition towards others as human beings, especially the vulnerable. These would be questions of virtue. How might also the language of praise and wonder in considering human gestation place limits on our interventions? As Daly suggested earlier, recapturing a speculative interest in nature and human embryonic development might help extinguish some of our pretensions and cultivate a proper sense of humility and further refine our desires. Reflecting on the incarnation may assist with this, even if it cannot be enlisted to do more specific moral work when it comes to SHEEFS. Thank you. Thank you.